what the steps would be for the lab in lab 6. Again, this is the Amatral book, lab 6, which stands for Learning Activity Packet. And lab 6 is on PLC timers and counters. So the first part of the lab 6 would be to do the timers, which will be skills 1, 2, and 3. Skill 1 is the on delay timer, skill 2 is the off delay timer, and skill 3 is a retentive timer, which is something that you did not get to do when we were doing the micro 820 labs. The on delay and off delay are identical to how the timers work in the micro 820. The retentive timer is a new type of timer that basically will hold its count value if you pause the count, and then when you restarted it, it'll pick up right where you left off. So just to review, we kind of went through the first lab and kind of got through the learning curve of how to create a project and get connected to the Siemens S7-1200 stations, but we'll do, I'll show you those steps again. So first we'll open up TIA Portal, and this is what we get when we open up TIA Portal, and then we will create a new project. And in this case, I'll call it lab 6, and I'll call it timers. And version 15.1 is fine. There's no other option here, of course. You can enter your name as author and any comments that you like to put there. Comments are always a great idea. This will create the project. And if you recall, our next step will be we have to add the device for the project. All right, that finally came up. So we need to configure a device. And we will choose Add New Device. And we'll get an option here. We want to choose the S7-1200. And we highlight, or we expand that, and we expand CPUs. And as we learned the other night in our first lab, we are using the 1214C, the DC, DC, DC. And we'll expand that option. That gives us 3 additional selections here. And just remember that each station has a label that tells you what model you have. So very important to choose the right model. If you don't, then you might have to restart from scratch. You can change your project, or you can change your device in the project, but it might wipe out your logic. So you want to make sure that if you have the AG31 or the AG40 station, no stations are AE, so they'll all either be the AG31 or AG40. So choose accordingly. I'll choose the 31 this time. We'll get a choice for the model. It's listed, and then a choice for the version. In this case, there's no other version but 3.0. And we'll hit Add. There were a few stations that had issues with firmware the other night too, and we'll have to, those are kind of isolated to certain cases. If it gives you a firmware incompatibility error and you did choose the right model, then you can go back and change your firmware version in the configuration. And if that happens to you, I will show you how to do that. All right, so we finally get to our project, our device information. So you should get this screen probably come up first as default. If we recall, the only thing we had to really worry about here was setting the IP address, and that was under Profinet interface and Ethernet address. The IP address, when you create a new project, is given by default as 192.168.0.1. Our stations are all kind of set for a different IP address. So if you don't change this IP address it will overwrite the IP address in your PLC, and that is not a problem if that happens. But we want to try to keep the match what's in the PLC that's already there. Again, there's a label on the PLC that tells you what your IP address is. But if you don't set it, it's okay. We'll still know the address to get connected to it. So our next step in the lap in the skill 1 is an on delay timer. So we'll go to program box and we'll come to the main OB1 and we'll double click on main, and that will open up the logic editor, which allow me to enter my my logic on the rungs. So network 1, that stands for basically rung 1. And what's going to happen in the lap 6 labs is you're basically going to create a simple ladder that will basically be a timer, an on delay timer, and then skill 2 is the off delay timer, skill 3 is the retentive timer. So of course, one thing we have to have is we have to be able to trigger the timer. So we will add a normally open contact, and we'll tie it to the first push button that's in the station. So we can go %I 0.0. And that will link that contact to the very first push button, which happens to be the green push button on the training station. Then we need to add the timer. So at the moment, we just have these very basic elements up here to choose from. We can come over here into the instructions, and you can see that we can expand on more instructions. Basic, extended, technology, as they so Siemens kind of organizes them in different buckets here. So for basic instructions, we have timer operations that are kind of up to the top of the list, luckily. So we can expand that, and we see we have TON, TOF, and TONR. These will be the 3 timers that you'll be playing with in these skills 1, 2, and 3. So we're going to grab TON, which is an on delay timer. We'll highlight it, we'll drag it, or select it and drag it to the rung. So what happens now is we get this window pops up, call options. If we recall from our Siemens S7-1200 introduction presentation, the one that we had online, basically said that there were a few different types of memory spaces, right? There's a %I table, %Q table, %M, and there was this other one that was in there called a %dB for data block. So the timer is going to use that %dB memory space. It doesn't really mean that we have to worry about that too much. The PLC will kind of sort that out on its own, but just know that it's going to store whatever memory requirements. It has to have a little bit of working memory space for timers to work. It'll put it in this %dB. So it's going to give it a name. We want to give this data block a name. By default, it says IEC timer 0dB. I think the lab itself tells you to rename your timer to TON timer 1. So TON timer 1. We'll choose, we'll leave this as automatic, and we'll hit OK. So now we have a %dB1 that was created. So that's our data block 1, and it is called TON timer 1. And there's only really 2 things to worry about here, or perhaps 3. There's the preset value. There's the elapsed time, which again, we don't really have to do anything here. This is our elapsed time, but we can reference this in the program. And then our Q, right? What are we going to do when the timer times out? So the last thing we'll do is we'll add, of course, a coil towards the end of this rung. And let's just say we're going to turn on an output. So we'll turn on the first output, which will be %Q 0.0. All right, so the very first light on the training station will turn on when this timer times out. So come back to the timer. We do have to give it the preset time value. So let's just see what happens here. We're going to say it's a 10-second timer. I believe the lab calls for 10-second timer. So if I just type in 10 and hit enter, you'll see that we get a similar structure to what happened with the micro H20s. We get T and then a hashtag or a pound symbol and then a 10, but it chose MS for milliseconds. So the default value for a timer in Siemens is going to be milliseconds if I didn't specify it. So what you'll have to do is you'll come back here and we're going to change this to S, and let's see if this works. It does. So now we have a 10-second timer. So that actually was very similar to the micro H20 from Rockwell. Again, the elapsed time, we'll leave this blank. And of course, the lab has you do a few extra steps here to create a like a one rung that shows that when this energizes, it turns on a light. And then when another, I think, rung that basically shows that when it's it's off, when it's so it kind of just shows you how the timer works, right? So very straightforward. Once you do that, you can download the program and test it out. Skill 2 is to make this basically an off delay timer. Now, the way how the book is written, it always says, hey, shut down the station and then basically come back in with a new lab. Don't have to do that, of course, when you're jumping from skill 1 to skill 2 to skill 3. If you want to do a real shortcut method, if you were to double click on this block, you'll find that we can actually just change it to TOF right on the spot. Now, our DB stayed DB1 and our timer name stayed TON for timer on delay, timer 1. You could probably change that if we want to here. Perhaps, maybe not. It's okay for purposes of just testing in the lab that this doesn't match up. But now this will act the exact opposite. So the first time when it was TON, when I pressed and held the input down, the timer would start timing up to 10 seconds. And then after you held it for 10 seconds, then the output would turn on. In this case, it'd be the exact opposite. When I press the button, this will turn on instantly. And then when I let off the button, this will start counting down from 10. This will stay on even when I took my finger off the button. And once this timer times down from 10 seconds, then this turns off. So that's the off delay timer. So that's skill 2. So skill 2 would be to change to an off delay, download it, and test it out and see how it behaves. Skill 3, it would be once again to come here and change it to the TONR. So that is a on delay retentive timer. And what that stands for, or what that means again, is when it's an on delay timer first off, so it has to, the trigger has to be on for that particular time for this output to turn on. But what's going to happen is that if it's 10-second timer, when I press down on the on button, if I take my finger off of it before 10 seconds, the timer will actually hold its value. So let's say I held it down for 3 seconds and took my finger off the button. Then this elapsed time should say 3 seconds. Then when I press the button again, when I press the start button again, it will start timing, picking up from 3 seconds. So it'll go 4, 5, 6. If I take my finger off again, it'll hold at 6. If I press it again, it'll continue 7, 8, 9, and then 10. And once it gets to 10 seconds, this will energize. So that's a great use for situations where you might have to pause the count for some period of time and you don't want to have to start over again. Because what happens in the on delay timer that's not retentive, if you took your finger off the button at 3 seconds, then when you press your finger back on the button again, it's going to start all over again from 0. So you have, it basically clears it out. Whereas a retentive timer will hold it for you. One other additional pin you see here on the block is an R. And R stands for reset. So if there was a particular reason why you wanted to reset the counter or the timer before, so let's say you you held it down for 3 seconds, and then you let your finger off. And let's say you did want to reset the timer to start back at 0. Then you can trigger the reset, send a reset signal to it. That will clear the block back to 0. And then when you press the on button again, it'll start counting from 0. So only if you trigger the reset would that happen. So you probably don't have to wire anything to the reset. That'll be one thing you'll find out when you work through the lab. All right. So that's basically the first half of lap 6. It's going to be skills 1, 2, and 3, and working with the timers. And take your time, experiment with how the timers work. Just kind of get a good feel for how they behave before you move on to the counters.